Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is standing room only this evening, which is fantastic. It's fantastic for the Institute, and I'm sure a tribute to our good colleague and speaker this evening, Professor Shane O'Neill, who's going to give our last Grand Challenge lecture before Christmas, the last of this year, 2017. Just a few housekeeping notices. Two housekeeping notices. One is that the fire exits are just there on the right. Should the alarm go off, we're not anticipating that. The second notice from me is those who've just come across from the Vice-Chancellor's drinks, no singing at the back halfway through the lecture. But it really is great to see such a large and lively audience. So tonight's speaker this evening, Professor Shane O'Neill, requires no introduction for many of you here this evening. He is the Pro-Vice-Chancellor and Executive Dean of, Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Advancement and Global Engagement and Executive Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences. I should really know what your title is. Should trip off my tongue, Shane, but it didn't quite. Shane is, as an academic though, is a Professor of Political Theory at Keele University. He arrived at Keele in September 2016, having completed an extended term as Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at Queen's University, Belfast. And it was at that time when he was still fresh and new to the university, we invited him to take part in a Grand Challenge lecture. I'm not quite sure if you quite anticipated what you let yourself in for, but here you are this evening, and it doesn't seem very long ago since we asked you that question, and here we are tonight, so delighted that you agreed to take up the challenge of that. As an undergraduate, Shane studied in his native city for a joint honours degree in history and politics at University College Dublin, where he remained there as a postgraduate scholar to undertake a master's in moral and political philosophy, before moving to Scotland for doctoral studies at Glasgow University. Shane's first academic post was as a lecturer in the Department of Government at Manchester University before joining Queen's University Belfast in 1994. At Queen's, he became Professor of Political Theory in 2002 and was head of school from 2001 to 2009. Twice in those years, he was asked to lead colleagues in creating newly expanded multidisciplinary schools within the university. And I think this is an area of Shane's contribution, particularly to the Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences, that we value extremely highly, his commitment to interdisciplinarity and that willingness to look across a broad range of subjects, a broad range of academic disciplines, in a way that really adds a lot to what we do here at Keele. During his years as Dean of the Faculty of Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences at Queen's, he also undertook a range of formal leadership roles, including University Envoy to the Americas. It sounds an incredibly grand title. But he was also a Fulbright Senior Scholar at the University of Pennsylvania from 2004 to 2005, and has held visiting professorships at Hong Kong University, Macquarie University in Sydney, Australia, and Queen's University, Ontario in Canada. Shane's primary research interests have continued to focus on debates in contemporary moral and political philosophy, specifically in clarifying the demands of justice and outlining conditions of democratic legitimacy both within the state and beyond it. Tonight's lecture will explore what Shane is calling the fabric of global justice, the history and the structure of those hierarchical relations between the peoples of the world that have been imposed by power throughout the colonial and neo-colonial modern eras. So without further ado, I welcome Professor Shane O'Neill to give the last of the Grand Challenge lectures for 2017. Shane.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan, for that very kind introduction. Thanks to Joe and Steve and everyone at the Institute for the work they've done in organising this event. They're always organised to a very high standard. I think those of you who are regulars here will agree. And thank you very much for coming. I know you could be doing so many other interesting things this evening. You could be shopping or watching football or I don't know what, but I appreciate it anyway coming to listen to me. So I definitely do recall being asked to do a Grand Challenge lecture and thinking, I made the mistake of saying that I had been doing some research on this topic, and before I knew it, I was being roped in to do one of these lectures. But it's a great opportunity, so I'm looking forward to doing so. Unlike external visitors who invariably say really nice things about Keele at this point in the evening, I'm lucky enough to get to stay here. But I'm going to kind of just say something at the outset about the central place I think that this institute and this series actually has in the contemporary life of this university. I mean, the institute is very much a symbol of, I think, our efforts to kind of reimagine the original vision of the university, as Jonathan referred to. And as I think you all know, at the heart of that vision was a uniquely distinctive and innovative commitment to interdisciplinarity and to the integration of the arts and sciences in both education and research. And for me, actually, that commitment to interdisciplinarity isn't just what we often talk about, these problems are so complex and so on that you can't possibly address them from the perspective of one discipline. And that's absolutely true. But actually, from what I know of Lindsay's vision, so Lindsay, who was the key founder, really, of the institution, it was also a kind of a moral commitment to interdisciplinarity. And I think part of it was his reflections on what had happened in Germany in the 1930s and so on, and the catastrophe of World War II, and the idea that a really advanced civilized society with lots of highly educated people, specialists in all sorts of fields, had somehow lost the grasp on the moral realities of life, basically. And I think so there is a need for us, no matter how specialist we are in particular areas, not to lose the big picture. And that's I think, one of the key reasons why interdisciplinarity and our commitment to it is so important. And I think at this historical moment, which I think many of us see as being rather disturbingly like the 1930s, it is particularly important that we at Keele and in other civilized organisations continue to engage vigorously in public debates on the most pressing and urgent issues of the day. And I think this lecture series is a really critically important vehicle for doing that work. And in fact, that ethos and commitment was one of the things that very much attracted me to come to Keele not so long ago. So it really is a particular pleasure for me to be here tonight. Two other quick things to mention before I get into the topic, really. One is to flag up the fact that the lecture is double badged, not only as a Grand Challenge lecture, but it's also a contribution to our new interdisciplinary lecture series on race equality, which is organised by Udeni Salmon, a colleague in the management school. I'm very pleased to be co-chairing with Sami Khan, who I think is here this evening, our Race Equality Charter self-assessment team, which is providing us as an institution, I think, with a very important opportunity to examine kind of critically the extent to which, even as an institution, we participate and perpetuate racial injustice, and to try and address those issues insofar as vigorously as we can. I mean, as you'll hear later in the lecture, the persistence of racial inequality is central to my account of global injustice. And it should make it clear to us that the negative impact of global injustice isn't only felt in faraway places, but that it also leaves a mark right here, right now, in all of our institutions, in all societies. So finally, one thing to mention, I think it's the right time to welcome a colleague, collaborator and good friend, Nick Smith, who is here on another flagship project of this institute, which is the Visiting Institute Fellowship Scheme. So Nick has come here to work with me on a project we're entitling The Fabric of Justice, and it's in part related to what I'm going to be talking about tonight. But Nick's initial focus in this shared project will be on to evaluate the increasingly topical suggestion that an unconditional basic income might be considered as an important aspect of the achievement of social justice. And I think their plan is to bring those projects together and to do some critical assessment of the idea of a universal basic income, a global universal basic income. And that's, so I'm very much looking forward to that. You're welcome, Nick, who's here at the front. And the opportunity for Nick will be here for a few months. So others will have a chance to speak with him about those issues. Okay, so there's lots of discussion. We're not the only university who talks about grand challenges, okay? And so I just want to say something at the outset about what defines a grand challenge. And as I think you probably all know, I'm from Ireland, and the word grand is probably the most overused word in Irish. And I just wanted to say that the way in which we talk about grand challenges is pretty much the opposite to the everyday usage of the word grand in Ireland. So when you say grand in Ireland, if someone says, "Do you have a good day at work?" "Yeah, grand." That really means it was very uneventful, nothing really happened, and I couldn't be bothered telling you about it. So it's kind of what we mean by when we talk about grand challenge is pretty much the opposite of the everyday Irish usage of grand. It's brave of me to mention Ireland this week, but anyway. When we speak of grand challenges then, in relation to this series, we're referring to significant and complex problems that are impressive in their scale. And what I mean by impressive, of course, is that they're extremely daunting, disturbing, vexing, urgent problems that we face. It seems to me sometimes Research Council and other funders are a little narrowly focused when they speak about grand challenges on maybe technical solutions to specific issues, rather than, as I see it, on deepening our understanding of the nature of these complex problems or explaining them adequately before we even look for a solution. But generally speaking, the use of the term grand challenge does seek to specify those most pervasive and persistent problems facing humanity. Now, it is pretty clear, of course, that none of those issues can be addressed adequately from the perspective of one academic discipline. And you'll typically find listed among grand challenges extreme poverty, access to safe drinking water, adequate sanitation, food security, epidemic diseases and deaths from treatable conditions, war, conflict-related threats to security, migration crises, human trafficking, modern slavery, degrading work practices, environmental degradation, climate change, gender inequalities. You don't always see the persistence of racial inequalities or other legacies of colonialism listed, but I hope to make clear tonight you absolutely should see that always listed in such a list. Now, that's a far from an exhaustive list, but it's pretty clear to me they are among the most persistent and pervasive problems facing humanity. And they are issues that, no matter how powerless we feel, they are issues about which we collectively as human agents have some degree of control. Doesn't feel like we have a lot, but collectively as humanity we do have some control. And all of them are related to, I think, the collective failings of our generation and those who preceded us to achieve the sort of relations between human beings that one would expect were we to meet the demands of justice, as I hope to clarify. They all also represent problems that transcend national borders. Some might find that uncomfortable, but it seems to me it's not so easy to seal one's country off from the impact of, or indeed the responsibility for, these global problems. So these grand challenges are examples of failings to attend to and to strengthen the fabric of justice among human beings who share this world. And for that reason, given its multi-dimensional complexity and the comprehensiveness of its reach, I think that the reality of deep global injustice may well be the grandest, if that's the right way to put it, of all grand challenges. It certainly strikes me as the most disturbing and daunting and the most threatening to human well-being. So I think those remarks should serve to justify the choice of topic for the evening's lecture. Okay, so I'm going to do something here which is going beyond the call of duty for the series. Okay, I'm briefly going to refer to some points of connection with the last lecture in this series, and that may be of particular interest to the students who I think have to reflect on these lectures, poor souls. Okay, so Kate Pickett was here a couple of weeks ago, and she gave an absolutely brilliant lecture. It was intimidatingly brilliant. And there's just about everything she said I agree with, within its own terms, let's put it that way. But one immediate point of contrast between her approach and mine is that I have no graphs, apart from hers that I've put a big X through. And that just reflects a methodological difference. So if you've come here expecting to see a lot of graphs, you're at the wrong lecture. I'm sorry to disappoint you. You should have come to Kate's instead if you weren't there. So while I don't tend to produce graphs in my research, which is pretty typical for political theorists, many colleagues will know that I do like graphs and data when it comes to other aspects of my job. I'm very keen, in fact, as a lot of you know, I'm very keen on using data and evidence as one, not the only one, but one important source to draw on as we evaluate what we're doing in our work. But anyway, Kate provided lots of evidence to show us that the more egalitarian any particular country is, the less problems it has, basically, and the better the standards of well-being are likely to be. It was very interesting and compelling and convincing, really, and there was lots of evidence behind it. But the title of her lecture was The Immorality of Inequality. And we didn't get any argument, at least until the Q&A, setting out why inequality was immoral. Now, I did say this to Kate over dinner, so I'm not going behind her back. We had an interesting discussion. But I'm hoping to balance things out here a bit by focusing on arguments about morality and justice without any graphs. And when it comes to grand challenges in general, I do see a clear need for not only interdisciplinary collaboration, but also for the complementarity of a variety of methodological approaches. Now, the second key point of contrast with between Kate's approach and mine is that she focused very much on comparisons between relatively rich countries or nation states, and not at all on injustices or inequalities that transcend state boundaries. It did come up in one perceptive question, but now there was an understated set of assumptions in her lecture, I think, about the bounded nature of nation-state communities as the key elements in her ontology of an international rather than a global order. And there are, I think, serious drawbacks to such an approach, which I'll return to shortly. So I've no graphs. I've been at other lectures here which made brilliant use of poetry or drama or high-resolution pictures. None of that. It's just kind of me talking, arguing. Right. So you're going to learn a bit about contemporary political theory. Some of you know a bit about it already, and some of you may not have wanted to know too much about it, but anyway. So political theorists and philosophers often write as if they had the last word on what the demands of justice are, be that at national or global level. Their job, they seem to suggest, not explicitly, but it's in the tone, is to clarify for us all what justice is. And the presumption is that other people could then get on with achieving it. Now, I think there's a misguided sense of epistemological privilege there, and it's connected to some of the problems that have infected, I think, the dominant approach to the subject of political theory. So one purpose of this lecture tonight is to allow me to offer a critique of the dominant paradigm in my own subdiscipline. And one part of that critique is connected to its isolationist tendencies and its failure to engage productively in interdisciplinary collaborations. And I think this is a sense that echoes Lindsay's warning about the dangers of disciplinary thinking. I think clarifying the demands of justice is far too important a task to be left to political philosophers. But more importantly, however, I want to highlight the responsibility that academics who investigate questions of justice have in political practice. There's the cost of failure. In other words, to fail to make, if you're talking about justice and you're claiming to be an academic expert in justice, and you don't connect that in some way to relevant political practice or to experiences of injustice in the world, then I don't think we can really say that no harm has been done. It's actually, by failing to challenge the power behind injustice, that theory then, in effect, I think, becomes a further contribution to the defense of an unjust status quo, an accessory, indeed, to continuing injustice. There's an opportunity cost there. If you're being well paid to investigate questions of justice, and you're doing it in such a way that's completely abstracted from and making no contribution to political practice, I think that is an opportunity cost that we can ill afford. So it seems to me that to matter greatly that academic research that purports to investigate injustice and unnecessary human suffering should strive to make clear the connection between theory and practice. It seems essential to refer to and analyse actual historical realities, not least the legacy of historical wrongs and the need to try and engage in appropriate action to address those wrongs. Sometimes, and I've felt this many times over the years, you can be at academic seminars in political theory about justice, but it can feel like you're in another world. And I think there is a failing there that I'm going to try and say more about. So much of the presumptively progressive and undoubtedly well-meaning contemporary academic work on global justice is characterised by, to my mind, a crippling failure to make connections between theory and practice that are required if those theories are going to contribute to the struggle for human freedom. I have a sense that some academics working in this field are what we might say in retreat from reality. They're so depressed about how grim the world is that they're taking refuge in an abstract theory about how an ideally just world might look like. But I don't think that's an excuse, really, to try and operate and think about your theoretical reflections in a way that is connected to experiences of injustice, particularly. So in this pretty short presentation, I'm trying to do something, it's a fairly outrageously ambitious proposal, really, which is to argue that we need a new paradigm for the theory of global justice. I'll tell you what the dominant one is in a second. We need, I think, to change fundamentally the focus of the dominant theoretical conversation so that we can begin to grasp what I'm referring to as the fabric of justice, fabric of global justice. So the focus I'm suggesting should be on a comprehensive process of decolonization, since this allows us to understand and thereby begin to overcome the most significant sources of historical and ongoing global injustice. Okay, so in this slide, I'm just sketching out very briefly how the argument goes, the argument I'd like to make for this alternative paradigm. And after that, I'm going to summarize some of those points depending on the time I have left. So the topic of global justice, and we might define that as the moral obligations we have to one another as human beings rather than as citizens of one political community. So that topic has in recent decades become an appropriately central concern in contemporary political theory. Whereas up until fairly recently, theories of justice focused almost exclusively from the context of one political community, often assumed to be the nation state. Much of the theoretical conversation, at least, has moved on to the global terrain. This new area of focus is often said to be reflective of the historical process of increasing globalization and a growing awareness of a deepening interdependence among peoples, states, and regions of the world. Both the causes of and the likely solutions to many of the grand challenges referred to earlier clearly do lie beyond the nation state or regional boundaries. So the implication is that questions of global justice are now arising because we have an increasingly globally interdependent world. Now, part of my argument, however, is that relations between the peoples of the world have a much longer history than is implied by the normal usage of the term globalization, which is normally meant to refer to fairly recent decades, really. There have been issues of justice in global relations for hundreds of years. So unless we want to broaden the concept of globalization to incorporate the history of colonization and subjugation that was visited on the rest of the world by the North Atlantic powers throughout the modern era, then it would be a mistake to tie considerations of justice, of global justice, too closely to those developments that are the concern of theorists of globalization. Now, a tendency among the earliest celebrated attempts to theorize global justice, I'm talking about 25, 30 years ago in the academic literature, and this does remain the main strand, the tendency has been to try to extend influential theories or influential theoretical accounts of domestic justice to a global level. And I'll say a little bit more about some of the key features of that dominant approach shortly. So it's really the efforts to theorize the demands of egalitarian liberalism for the globe. I'm then going to go on to explain why those mainstream contemporary theories of global justice have, for the most part, failed to ask what I take to be the right kind of questions, or to connect theory with practices of emancipation. And that is partly connected to their method of rational constructivism that they employ, which I'll explain. I'm going to suggest that in order to develop an appropriately critical account of global justice, we need to adopt a different method. One of what I'm proposing is critical normative reconstruction, which I borrow from a critical theorist, Axel Honneth. It seems to offer a much more promising way to try, at least, to make meaningful connections between theory and practice. Briefly, then, I want to just expose the limitations of any attempt to theorize justice within the frame of the nation state. So the main critics of the kind of cosmopolitan egalitarian liberals that have been dominant in the debates have been theorists who argued that actually it's the nation state is the only relevant really context or side of questions of justice. And I'm going to try and explain why that is also the wrong kind of move. It seems to me that any retreat to the nation state as the sole site of justice also leads to deeply flawed accounts, not only of global justice, but also of justice within the nation state. So that leads me to the most challenging bit, which is to identify a framework that can ground an alternative paradigm that avoids the abstraction of proceduralism, the dominant approach, without turning away from the ways in which relations of justice transgress nation-state boundaries. And I'm going to suggest that we need to think of the struggles for global justice as the work of completing substantively an historical process of decolonization. The main reason to turn in that direction is that any attempt to think about the demands of global justice without reference to the systematic practices of racialized colonial oppression by North Atlantic powers in the history of modernity seems extraordinarily naive to me. Yet, you may not be surprised, given what I've said about the dominant approach already. Our university libraries, and this one I'm sure included, are full of books published on the topic of global justice by excellent university presses that have absolutely no reference whatsoever in their index to the terms colonialism or race. I've done the search myself. I spent an afternoon once looking at all the main books that are taught in courses about global justice. Very few of them have the word colonialism in their index. Even fewer have the word race. That's pretty extraordinary, you might think. So it's almost as if it's no longer relevant to this topic of global justice that a small number of dominant powers managed to subjugate most of the peoples of the world in the relatively recent past, imposing on them some of the most egregious forms of misrecognition and injustice in human history. Contemporary struggles against global injustice are marked, it seems to me, indubitably by the legacy of the historical process of colonialism and neo-colonial domination. So it is important to highlight how this alternative account of global justice has to engage fully with critical race theory. If we just think momentarily about modern world history, it seems obvious to me that one key structural aspect of it has been the use of the social construction of race to justify practices of colonialism and slavery, and thereby to shape what has been referred to as a global political system of white supremacy. This structure of racial inequality, in spite of formal decolonization processes, is one that continues to shape the contemporary world, both globally and within each nation state. So if we're to address global injustice, then we also have to make explicit reference to racial injustice, since they seem to be inextricably linked. I'll finish at the end by highlighting some points of contrast between the dominant paradigm and the alternative that I'm proposing. Okay, so I'm going to be brief here. Some of you may know a little bit about what we can call the dominant approach to theorizing justice. And the dominant way to think about it is basically to think about it in terms of distributive justice and to think about it in terms of ideal theory. So John Rawls is the kind of seen as the father of modern political theory. It seems to have resurrected modern political theory as a systematic way of thinking about questions of justice. And Rawls basically argued that our focus should be, so he did see justice as the first virtue of social institutions, as he said it. The subject of justice should be the basic structure of society. But he did assume, and this is him in his hugely influential book, A Theory of Justice, 1971, he did see the focus really beyond what he called a closed system of cooperation. In other words, if we're assuming we're talking about a nation state kind of context. The main thrust of the argument is that in order to achieve justice, we need to mitigate for the effects of natural and social distributions that are morally arbitrary from his point of view, which basically means that the fact that you're born into a rich family or you live in a kind of privileged neighborhood or whatever, that we have to mitigate for that when we compare that to somebody who's born without those kind of privileges. When we're thinking about justice, we need to somehow find a way to abstract from and get beyond those arbitrary kind of considerations. Likewise, he wants to mitigate for the good or bad fortune associated with whether you've got a high IQ or whether you're good looking or not good looking and so on. So these are kind of natural and social products of a kind of a lottery, and that they should not be accepted as fair outcomes. So in order to think our way about what a just world would be, we need to find a way to mitigate for those kind of results of good or bad luck, if you like. So he comes up with this idea that we have this hypothetical situation known as the original position, where we kind of have to imagine that we didn't know what our social or natural circumstances were. So you have to think your way into a position, if you can imagine it, where you didn't know if you were a man or a woman, you didn't know what your kind of ethnic background was, you didn't know your social kind of background. You just knew that you occupied some position in society. You didn't know what it was. And he argues that if we were to get ourselves into that frame of thinking, we would agree on a certain set of principles that he takes then to be actually the principles of fairness that should operate in a just society. So he thinks we'd all agree that we should all have equal basic liberties, because we would be afraid, not knowing what position we actually occupy, to be an oppressed minority. So we'd kind of want to make sure that everyone had equal basic rights and liberties. And then in terms of socioeconomic issues, we would want to regulate the inequalities in society so that, first of all, they were open to what he calls fair equality of opportunity, so that no one, the idea there really is that equal talents should be rewarded equally. So you shouldn't be in any way held back by social circumstances in achieving and realizing your talent. Okay? And the second one is the famous difference principle, which basically means that you'd only agree to any inequality if it was to the benefit of the worst off. Okay, we could go on at great length about Rawls and very interesting theory and so on. But that's just, in a nutshell, the core of it. Now, subsequently, in about 15, 20 years later, some Rawlsian acolytes began to think that we could extend this Rawlsian framework to the whole world, in fact. So they would argue that the nation of your birth is also arbitrary from a moral point of view, just as the social circumstances in which you're born and the outcome of any natural endowments that you had or whatever. So they argued that there was a case for thinking of the original position as a global hypothetical situation rather than one just to be referred to a closed society. So they argued that those principles, those Rawlsian principles of fair equality of opportunity, the difference principle where all inequalities had to be to the benefit of the worst off, and the basic rights and liberties, that they should just be extended to the whole world. There was an argument that we should have a global, cosmopolitan, egalitarian account of justice. And the demands of justice within one society were the exact same as the demands of justice for the whole world. Now, there are lots of variants on that way of thinking. So some left libertarians argued that we're all entitled to an equal share of the value of the world's resources, which means you have 100% inheritance tax, nobody kind of inherits anything from anyone else. Then there's the libertarian side of it, is that what you do with the equal share you have of the resources, it's really up to you. You can decide to do nothing with it, or you can decide to try and become a lot richer, etc., etc. There's lots of different variants of these kind of fairly abstract arguments about what justice in a just society would look like, or in a just world would look like. But they all focus on distributive questions, on the rights and opportunities to which individuals are entitled to morally by virtue of their humanity. And they also share a methodological commitment to ideal theory. So what we need to do is work out, through an appropriate procedure, whatever hypothetical argument you want to put, we need to work out what ideally justice would require, and only then leave it to others usually to work out what that means in practice. Now, I can find all of that very rationally engaging and so on, and much of me, and I've taught lots of it in my time over the years. And a lot of the debates within political theory, there's lots of sophisticated arguments going into fine details about these kind of models. And an awful lot of mainstream political theory is just about those models kind of being compared with one another and being refined and so on. But the focus, anyway, has continued to be on the justification of principles through some hypothetical arguments that abstract from reality, so that we can clarify those principles. And we should only worry later about how to apply them to the world. Now, it seems to me, when I'm being a bit facetious, that that's fantastic for intelligence after dinner conversation, but actually for making a difference in the world, not so sure. So, grasping the fabric of global justice then. So I've already mentioned this shared project that I'm engaging in with Nick here. And we borrow that term, the fabric of justice, from Axel Honneth, this theorist I've already mentioned. And Honneth uses it to summarize what he thinks is wrong with that dominant approach to theorizing justice. He wants to, and there's a brief quote from him, to correct our customary conception of social justice by redirecting it from a fixation on principles of distributing goods towards measures for creating symmetrical relations of recognition. Okay? So he's trying to build on insights from Hegel primarily, that relations of reciprocity are, in fact, the conditions of individual autonomy. So if you want to have individual freedom, you need to nurture a kind of social context in which such individual freedom can be achieved for all. So social and institutional relations that create conditions for the realization of equal autonomy are what he calls the fabric or the material of justice. And that should therefore be the focus of a theory of justice. So rather than engaging in thought experiments about hypothetical agreements on principles we might agree to in ideal circumstances and so on, theorists should rather be seeking to reconstruct the underlying normative basis of relations of mutual recognition across a whole decentered network of organizations and social spheres within which individuals struggle for freedom. So what Honneth's trying to do is to obviously take aim at this dominant approach, but also to expose them for being, if you were, ill-equipped to attend to the struggles against injustice that arise when people feel insulted by their treatment, not only by state institutions, but also in the workplace or at home or in school or in social media or in any other social context. So our concerns should be broadened to include those social relationships that have potential to either enable or constrain autonomy. Now, it seems to me that flipping it over from talking about the distribution of goods towards relations of recognition, there are at least two advantages there in terms of connecting theory and practice. The first is by insisting that the way in which principles of justice are thought to be justified, so how are they actually justified, is appropriately reflective of and relevant to actual historical struggles against real injustices in the past and in the present. And the second way is by seeking to show how a greater degree of justice might be realized in the future by transforming existing human relations that already have an underlying normative element to them. So the idea is that we want to extract, as it were, what the normative elements to good social relations are, and then try to instantiate more appropriately those normative principles that we already, as it were, are signed up to. So what I want to do is try and take that critical method, that critical normative reconstructive method, and apply it to questions of global justice. So it seems to be that when it comes to the problems of abstraction that I think attend to those kind of theorists that Honneth was criticizing, the problems that they have are exacerbated when it comes to questions of global justice, because they require, of course, a greater degree of abstraction from historical realities. Okay. So I'm going to be arguing that basically at global justice, if we want to understand global justice, we need a normative reconstruction of the historical struggles for freedom in the world. Okay, so recognizing justice beyond, I'm going to be brief here, because one of the things that I depart from Honneth in is that Honneth himself thinks that because of his attentiveness, as it were, to social realms of freedom, he focuses very much on questions in a domestic or within the context of the nation state. And I think that's a mistake, mainly because I think that the fact that relations between citizens in any one democratic community or any one nation state have to be considered in wider contexts, including the ways in which international and transnational relations have been shaped historically. So it's interesting that even when someone like Honneth focuses on his critical normative historical method, he's very much focused on countries like Germany, France, Britain, advanced kind of countries, in fact colonial powers, and he's telling the narrative of the normative underlying kind of basis for social relations and how struggles for inclusion within those societies advanced and included greater numbers of citizens and so on to be included as equals on equal terms within the democratic communities. But at no point does he mention that during those historical periods, these same countries were actually extracting massive resources and energy and wealth and from large parts of the world that they had subjugated. So there does seem to be a major kind of blind spot there in terms of the way in which most theorists that kind of retreat and focus on questions of justice within the nation state miss these issues of racist colonialism, basically. Okay, I'm going to move on to talk about the decolonization paradigm, because that's the primary kind of point of this, really, is to find an alternative basis for thinking about global justice. Okay, so at the heart of this kind of normative reconstruction of, I mean, it's a pretty ambitious project, right? So you're talking about the normative reconstruction of global history, basically. But at the heart of this reconstruction are those demands for political freedom that inspired struggles against colonialism, it seems, and that continue to motivate people across the world to realize meaningful and empowering forms of self-determination. And I want to point as evidence for why I'm tapping into what is an already accepted normative assumption in the world. I'm just going to mention the General Assembly of the United Nations adopted Resolution 1514 in 1960. So in December 1960, the UN produced the Declaration on the Granting of Independence, Colonial Countries and Peoples. Now it's not because I'm turning to international law as my kind of way of advancing this argument, but I think it does capture that there is a kind of normative commitment on the part of, international relations and the way in which countries see each other, at least formally. That this declaration, which was supported by all member countries except for 9 abstentions, I wonder if you could guess who the 9 abstentions were? We can play that game later. They're the ones you'd expect to have abstained. But this declaration is a clear and strong statement of a substantial ethical norm that signals a commitment to mutual respect between the peoples of the world. So in a way, thinking like Honneth, except on global terms, this was, if you like, the manifestation of the articulation of an underlying normative framework that had been achieved through struggle. Okay, so through struggles of decolonization, the world came to recognize a shared commitment to the principle of self-determination for the peoples of the world. So this commitment does indeed frame international law in ways that defend the self-determining freedom, sovereignty, and independence of all peoples. It is probably the most visible piece of evidence we have that those normative commitments to decolonization and to the collective self-determination of peoples are core to the already accepted ethical basis of international relations and to the freedom that individual people yearn for as a demand of global justice. So it seems to capture for me, at an international or a global level, the idea that relations of reciprocity are conditions of freedom. Okay, so rather than worry too much about the scope of justice, whether it's global or national, I think we need to consider how international relations might be reordered in practice so that they align with the accepted norms that recognize the equal standing of political communities as self-determining peoples. Now, such a reordering seems to me to require not just formal politics of decolonization, but actually the dismantling of any neo-colonial relations of domination that endure. so that each independent political community can be facilitated in enhancing the democratically supported freedom of its own citizens while working cooperatively with others to tackle injustices that transcend state boundaries. I think I'm fairly much stating the obvious when I say that the historical process of decolonisation has yet to fulfil its promise. Yet that promise of a new world order, constituted by relations of mutual recognition among free and equal political communities, remains core to the prospect of a more just global order. So that's why I'm referring to this account of global justice as the completion of a process of decolonisation. It seems that the most fruitful way to theorise global justice is to ask how an ongoing historical project of decolonisation is best to be completed. How can we ensure that all the peoples of the world actually do have the capability of realising effectively their self-determining freedom? I'm just going to note in passing that, of course, even the formal process of decolonisation has not been completed. There are many millions of indigenous peoples in the so-called New World, from a European perspective, who have yet to have the experience of being formally liberated from colonial rule. But even within those countries that have experienced a formal process of decolonisation, there's an important distinction to be made between that formal process and one that would overcome fully the injustices of colonialism. So a relevant question that has to be asked, I think, in each specific case, and it will be quite different in different cases, is the extent to which that formal process has facilitated collective self-determining freedom to be realised or instantiated in a meaningful and substantive way. Now, it might be suggested that colonial powers, and I think there's a lot of interesting historical research that does support this element of my argument, that colonial powers were willing to withdraw from their colonies in the period after the Second World War because the economic benefits of colonialism could be retained by them through alternative means and without the costs of maintaining responsibility for the people. So the most developed economies were able to exert financial, political, or military pressure so as to secure ongoing access to cheap goods and labour. They've also been able to ensure that global institutions can steer the course of development for other societies in ways that have allowed them the configuration of economic and political power relations to remain largely unchanged. So I'm thinking, the IMF, even the UN itself in terms of structure of its permanent membership of the Security Council and so on. So given the faith that many cosmopolitan theorists have in the potential of global institutions, I think we now have another reason to insist on a reconstructive approach that is sensitive to these kind of historical realities. Nationalism too, which remember I dismissed as not a viable alternative, however, is a bond of exclusive solidarity often forged through anti-colonial struggle, but it has often actually been a curse for most post-colonial societies. It has created tensions between majority populations and minorities, including separate colonial ones, of course, that have led to civil strife, instability, and war. So it seems that in the decades following formal decolonisation, during and after the Cold War, various effects of neo-colonial power have continued to undermine the prospects for real freedom in post-colonial contexts. The upshot for many of these societies has been high levels of conflict, associated challenges of corruption and political underdevelopment in many states and across strategically important regions. And that, of course, has made it difficult for many former colonies to create effective strategic alliances with other relatively poor countries within their region, continent, or beyond. Such alliances, had they been more effective, might have been a counterbalancing force within the international community. And some such alternative balance of power may have a better prospect of impacting on the ways in which the international community has grappled with those challenges that have threatened the security of all, but particularly those most vulnerable to the negative consequences of civil strife, economic underdevelopment, food maldistribution, and climate change. So decolonization, as I'm interpreting it, goes far beyond the formal achievement of self-governing independence. It involves also the realization of a new set of relationships based on equal respect between the peoples of the world, and in particular between formerly colonized peoples and dominant colonial powers. To achieve that set of relationships seems to require the overcoming of the legacy of colonialism, not only politically, with respect to the establishment of institutions and structures of self-governing autonomy, but also in relation to the economic, social, and cultural development of each of those self-determining peoples. To achieve such a set of relationships is to engage in the struggle for power at global level, such that the process of globalization, mentioned earlier, can be pursued in the interests of all countries. So, from a theoretical point of view, standing here as a theorist of global justice, I think what urgently requires investigation from this perspective are the historical realities of asymmetrical relations between the peoples of the world and the ongoing struggles of formerly subjugated peoples to achieve equal standing in the global order. Let me say something about critical race theory, because I've mentioned it a number of times. I've referred on a number of occasions to racialized colonialism. I think it is really important when theorizing questions of justice, whether global justice or justice within any particular nation state, to be explicit about racism. It's important to be explicit because racism was at the core of the historical process in which the self-defined white Europeans subjugated the rest of the world. Racist ideologies of white supremacy were clearly central to the narratives of justification that prevailed throughout the colonial era. It's also, I think, vital to recognise that enduring legacy of racism at global level and in the context of each society. Racist ideas and practices did not end with the demise of European empires. Indeed, given what I've said about the motivation and the capacity for global powers to maintain privilege through other neo-colonial means, the racist underpinnings of global injustice have been pretty much untouched by formal processes of decolonisation. But, and again I come back to some of the flaws within dominant mode of political theory, within that dominant mode of ideal political theory, at both domestic and global levels, the tendency has been to adopt a race-blind approach to this question, to imagine a world in which race or ethnic background would become irrelevant in an egalitarian society. But given the depth and historical persistence of racism and its impact on all aspects of human experience, from formal structures of international relations to everyday experiences of more subtle forms of insult, this again seems extraordinarily naive. Questions indeed need to be asked as to why there's been such an unwillingness to grasp the fabric of this aspect of social and global injustice. And there's been much less progress on this issue than there has in relation to gender, and I'm not saying there's been that much progress in relation to gender within political theory. And I think on the question of race, one reasonable conclusion may be that it is a predominantly white academic community, and philosophy is an unusually white discipline actually, certainly in the US, within that kind of academic community who have led this academic exploration of these issues. They've simply taken white privilege so much for granted that it has not made a significant impact on their consciousness, or at least not enough to become a central category of analysis within their theoretical framework. This Charles Mills, much underappreciated critical race theorist, he at least has made some impact on the academic discourse, and it should be far greater than the impact he has had. The epigraph here from Mill's book, The Racial Contract, when white people say justice, they mean just us. He's trying to capture that what he talks about, this racial contract. So what he means by a racial contract, Rawls, if you like, is a new version of contract theory, which again, through the canon of Western political philosophy, have been the key texts in terms of explaining to us how we come to have legitimate government and so on. Mills is using this idea of a contract not so much as a hypothetical kind of argument as to what we would agree to as being fair or just or legitimate. He's using it in a critical way to try to explain the historical facts of the modern world. He's asking the question, how is it that the modern world ended up with pretty much all white people ruling over non-white people? And he asks this question by suggesting that there is this unspoken racial contract that white people have benefited from, basically. Not all white people may be signatories to the contract, as he says, but all have benefited from it. That there has been this assumption of white supremacy, and that has infected the way in which historical development in the modern era particularly has played out. So it seems, whatever the merits of Mills's book, and it seems pretty compelling for me, race must be a category that's at the centre of any theoretical account of injustice. By presenting global injustice as decolonization, along the lines that I've tried to do here, I'm hoping to make it clear that most racial injustice and global injustice are inextricably intertwined. Okay. This is my multicolored slide. I hope it's readable. I'm just summarizing at the end. These seem to me some of the implications. I'm not going to go into detail about them, but these are some of the implications of the shift of paradigm that I'm advocating. Okay, so on the left-hand side, you have the dominant paradigm led by Rawls and all the other egalitarian, well-meaning egalitarian liberals who want to focus on ideals of global justice. Okay, so there's a, and then on the other side, on the right-hand side, is what I'm advocating in its stead. I'm not going to go into detail here, but these seem to be some of the shifts required in terms of the kind of questions we ask. Like, just like Kuhn with the original idea of a paradigm shift. We ask a different set of questions if we change our mindset to shift paradigm, okay? So on the ideal of global justice paradigm, the dominant one, there's a focus very much on positive, what are the ideals of justice? What would a just society look like? Whereas I'm saying we shouldn't be focused on that, actually. We should be focused on negative instances of historical injustice. That's a better way to start asking the right questions. On the left, you focus on distribution of goods, whereas I'm interested in relations on overcoming neo-colonial domination. On the left, race-blind egalitarianism. On the right, and right, I didn't mean that in terms of, well, I do mean it in every sense, but critical race consciousness. On the left, I'm not going to go into detail here, but it does seem to me that there's too much faith in global institutions as agents. I think the historical record of global institutions is so appalling that I am more interested in dispersed local responsibility as a way to address the grand challenges, if you like. I'm not going to go into detail here, but there's also an assumption on the right-hand side, sometimes they have a tendency to intervene in different parts of the world to help maintain order, whereas I think avoiding any dangers of neo-colonial interference is a better way to think about those kind of questions. And then again, finally on the left, individual rights and opportunities seem to be the main subject of justice for the ideal theorists, whereas I'm arguing that it should be the fabric of just relations among self-determining political communities. And that's it.